hosting this and for asking me to be part of it. First, I wouldn't be a budget person if I didn't say something about the Cadillac of New York State services that we've just heard about. We don't have a Cadillac. If we thought we had a Cadillac, the motor's been changed out and it's a Chevy actually inside. We have, on our health scores by Commonwealth surveys, middle distance healthcare rankings overall. Some of our indicators are at the very bottom of the barrel. So I wouldn't think that we're getting what we're paying for there. And the same thing with education. We did a blog posting recently. First of all, we're not at the point where we're talking about scraping the bottom of the barrel in the education system in terms of the cuts that have been on the table. Our blog posting has shown, and the research that we did for it showed that we've doubled our spending on education overall in the last 10 years. And that money, by and large, has not gone to class size reduction. There have been modest gains in class sizes. The real issue has been the compensation growth, and driven predominantly by fringe benefits. Pension costs have grown enormously. So I'll move into Ravitch right now, but I just kind of needed to say those couple of things. We need to be doing better with our money is the general message there. Okay, so let's talk about the Ravitch plan for a minute. First, I have to tell you that the Citizens Budget Commission ultimately supported the Ravitch plan with the very strong caveat that the whole plan needs to move forward together. We felt that the temptation would be great for the legislature to avail itself of the $2 billion in annual deficit financing and not pick up the rest of the package, which included some reforms that the CDC has long advocated. For many, many years, we've been in favor of gap balance for the state of New York. So, that was really our piece. We really want to see the whole package go together and not just selective taking of whatever people find more attractive in the budget process. We did have a serious concern about the timing. Remember, we have an executive budget on the table from Governor Patterson that is still live. It contained what we thought was a reasonable down payment on the spending reduction program for New York. About $5 billion of his gap closing plan was in spending reductions. Given that last year the federal stimulus money was used to support a budget that had a 10% overall increase in spending in it, and that this year the governor had a proposal on the table year over year that would have put us at about 0% increase, so cuts against inflation, but not overall in dollar terms. We felt that the timing of putting the $2 billion temptation for the borrowing in front of the legislature at this time was an unfortunate kind of lack of coordination in terms of the overall. So let's just talk about some of the specifics. And I'm going to be pretty candid and tell you that we had a very agonizing debate over whether we would support this plan. First of all, let's talk about GAP. GAP is good. GAP is better than what we have. For example, if you look at last year and you see the controller's financial report, we ran a $13.5 billion deficit last year on a GAAP basis. On a cash basis, we balanced to a positive effect of $1.9 billion in the general fund. How is this possible? Well, in cash, they drop the spending that they can't afford at the end of the year and roll it into the next year when the revenues don't come in. So, for example, we fell $4 billion short in our personal income tax settlement last spring. We just postponed the spending. So what you have in cash is a situation where you're able to have multi-year deficits throughout the period of time when we are seeing this downturn. That this has been a growing problem. It's again on the table this year. They want to drop cash spending and do some things to manipulate the deficit from one year to the next. So cash standard really makes it hard to tell what is actually going on within a fiscal year where GAAP lets you know that a little more closely. And that doesn't mean that GAAP is a panacea. In the city of New York, for example, where they have had GAAP balance, and not just a balanced budget, but their requirement is actually so strong that it requires zero balance at the close of the fiscal year. And this is a very important distinction. It's not just about the budget. It's about where you end up at the end of the year. Are you in balance? Are you not in balance? And although they started out under the Financial Control Act of having Financial Emergency Act of having a window there to not balance. They've actually made it stronger in their own city charter. But they can manipulate GAAP, they do. When they run a surplus, they prepay debt service, and they end up moving $2 and $3 billion sometimes from year to year. So it's not a panacea. What you're really looking for with a lot of these changes, budget reform proposals, the Ravitch plan, ultimately is to see kind of what happened in New York City, which is a cultural change. You want to have those things in place, those disciplinary measures in place, but the ultimate shift is a change in the behavior. It's not that the rules are necessarily in and of themselves going to solve the problem. There's still the ability to have bad behavior even with strict rules in place. It's about the cultural changes, a different culture. So the assumption in the Ravitch plan is that the balanced budget requirement, it will in itself impose this discipline. It's agnostic as to whether the source of the balance comes from revenues or spending. And as a group, we have long advocated for spending changes, believing that in the current circumstance, we do have a structural problem that ultimately will be unsustainable. If we have a do-nothing plan in this year, we'll have a $19 billion gap in year 3. So there is a piece of this that needs to happen from the spending side of the equation. And so the Ravitch plan has a standard in it, adequate progress, that this review board is going to look at and decide whether that is being met to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on the plan. We would like to see that have a little more definition to it. You can understand the beauty of a balanced budget requirement because it has political appeal in the sense that it's hard to think of ways to fix in spending reductions that you'd want to see fixed in. We have a process for making budgets. It's a democratic process. You're supposed to vote people out if you don't like the outcome. So to really think about putting in standards now that will last us for 3 and 4 years for changing circumstances is a very hard concept for us to come up with what we would want to see as a target for spending reductions put into that form. So it is a balanced budget requirement, but we believe in the adequate progress standard, there should be some definition and some greater view that some piece of it needs to come from more sustainable spending growth. And the real issue also is what happens after. The interesting thing about the Ravitch plan is that it assumes in 5 years, it pegs the size of the structural deficit, what's left beyond the volatility of the revenue stream at $13 billion. And it assumes that if you do GAAP and you go to the 5th year, that you'll be in balance going forward. And having looked at budgets for a long time, it is true that government spending tends to grow faster than the economy, and you have a deficit situation going forward in a lot of instances. So you would, think that there would be things necessary always to balance the budget. And so the question is, what happens after that 5th year? Where are we? Where are we left off? Or we're in balance forever going forward, or where there'll be there's always a need to kind of ongoing adjustment and, look at the budget on a cycle. The Albany track record of policing itself is not good, so we had concerns about enforcement. We had the view that the ability to refinance this debt, is there always, and so in that way you could have an escape clause to get out of whatever provisions you might put in the bond covenants. And we've seen it. People point to the LGAP example when they got rid of the spring borrowing. They put in a provision that said, going forward, no money would be carried across in a short-term way from fiscal year to fiscal year. But the MAC refinancing, which was done for the city bailout in the 70s, they did refinance that debt in the last downturn in 2002, and they stretched it out another 30 years. So we had some questions about the notion of the bond covenants. And the plan itself is a little bit ambivalent as to whether it would be in the transition bonds only or in all new debt issued going forward. All new debt issued going forward would be the stronger standard because you wouldn't just be able to refinance one piece of it and eliminate the other provisions. That being said, we did have a lot of reservations about putting these things in the bond covenants. Bond covenants are to support a capital plan. The capital plan is supposed to run smoothly and efficiently and in the least costly way it can. And so the concern was really, how would you want to adding that cost, which it will carry a cost, adding these complications into the bond covenants. It's going to raise the price of our borrowing a little bit. And so the real notion is that price worth paying to get the other part of the reforms that you want to see happen? Ultimately, we decided yes, but it definitely is something that in the Assembly version of the bill, for example, it's not, the bond covenant piece is not in the legislation itself. The intent is there, we have heard, but putting it in the statute, it's not there yet. And there's arguments about whether you'd want it in the statute in the first place. But the bond covenants is an important piece of the kind of stick that would need to be in place. Again, we would want to see it on a broader basis to all the new borrowing. Now, the use of money, the borrowed money, remember the state is heavily indebted already, and we have about $11 billion outstanding already from monies that we borrowed for operating deficits of the past. So it's a heavy burden, and so the view on the use of the money would be that in the spirit of the plan, it's supposed to help us move toward, it's a transition moving toward that gap balance. So, for example, we're doing hidden borrowing already every year when we don't pay bills and we drop a payment to the local school districts and say we'll pay you 2 months from now when the cash comes in. We're borrowing money from them. When we postpone any kind of payment, I think we're 2 payments behind in the payments to our Medicaid vendors. That's borrowing from them. So the state in a cash way is already borrowing a lot of money from people, and they're just shifting the funds around. So the Ravitch money, fundamentally, from our view, should be used to cover that transition, right? So it's not for restorations. It's not for sustaining spending at the school level that is, ultimately maybe sustainable, not sustainable. It's not to plug the budget gap and just say, all right, let's just make a deal and have $2 billion that we can restore. It's really to try to address, when you uncover these hidden borrowings, what is the true size of our deficit? How much do we really owe? What is the annual piece that we need to cover if we were going to get in a gap balance? So in some ways, if you even looked at that, you might say the $2 billion should be used to pay our debts that we're not paying this year because we're dropping spending on a cash basis, and to start going forward on a recurring. So those are really the kinds of concerns that we had. I think ultimately the whole concept is about a bridge. We had a bridge in the stimulus money. We might have a bridge in Ravitch. But what does this look like when we get off? What size island are we on? What are the contours of our spending? And that's where we need to really focus, because that has not been addressed to date. So my time is up, and thank you very much.